Our next panel is going to be moderated by Gregory Dietrich. Gregory is a graduate of the Columbia program. He is an independent architectural historian and preservation consultant and vice president of the Historic Districts Council. Gregory.
Well, welcome to Open Space in the Private Realm. And what I noted from watching the last panel session is that there is a bit of overlap between the concept of public and private. But I am delighted to have Thomas Mellins, Evan Mason, and Jeffrey Kressler today for our session. Today's panel is going to take us on an exploration of open space in public housing, urban backyards, and suburban neighborhoods. And following the presentations, we will have a panel discussion where I'll start the ball rolling, and then I'll open it up to the House for questions or comments. Our first speaker is Thomas Mellins, who will be offering an historic overview of open space in interwar and post-war public housing by tracing its evolution from a design perspective as a means of placing it within a preservation context. Thomas Mellins is an exhibition curator and author. Among the numerous exhibitions Mr. Mellins has curated or co-curated at the Museum of the City of New York are New York's Moynihan, A City on Paper, Saul Steinberg's New York, Campaigning for President, New York and the American Election, Only in New York, Photographs from Look magazine, and The American Style, Colonial Revival and the Modern Metropolis. Additionally, Mr. Mellins curated Celebrating 100 Years at the New York Public Library and an exhibition on the history of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, as well as exhibitions at the Yale School of Architecture, the South Street Seaport Museum, the Art Museum of the Americas, and the National Building Museum. Mr. Mellins is the co-author with Robert A.M. Stern and others of 3 volumes in a book series on the architecture and urbanism of New York City. New York 1880, New York 1930, which was nominated for a National Book Award, and New York 1960. Mr. Mellins has written for the New York Times as well as for Architectural Record, where he served as contributing editor. He's also served as scriptwriter for Pride of Place, Building the American Dream, which aired nationally on PBS. In 1999, he was designated a Centennial Historian of New York City by Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. And I would just like to add that for anybody who's doing research on New York City's built environment, his books, along with Robert A.M. Stern et al., are indispensable resources. And I say that personally and professionally as someone who is a big fan of that series. And I also wanted to mention that his centennial exhibition at the New York Public Library closes tomorrow. So perhaps you can piggyback the HDC walking tour along with a visit to the public library if you've not yet seen it. So I bring you Thomas.
Welcome. Thank you very much for that lovely and generous introduction. I think it's fair to assume that all of us, or most of us, know about the efforts of the great modernist architect, French architect Le Corbusier, to re-envision urban space and to imagine a very different kind of city based not on the individual building or the block as we know it, but on this concept of towers in the park. And I think it's also fair to assume that many of us know that this vision, while not realized in Paris, as Le Corbusier had dreamt of in the 1920s, was to a large extent realized by the New York City Housing Authority in the post-war period for a different segment of the population and in a different way, arguably a somewhat degraded vision, but perhaps not, and evolving in a particular way over time. But I think that what I want to do today is focus on New York and on other sources of that vision, other influences that the architects who worked for the Housing Authority would have been aware of, to better understand the design intent and in turn to inform our efforts to preserve those spaces. Many of the spaces that we will look at together today no longer exist in the form that we'll see them, or indeed, in some cases, don't exist at all. But I am looking at them, will look at them, in order to place current preservation efforts in some kind of historic context. I will also say, as a matter of full disclosure, and perhaps as a mea culpa, that you will not hear the firm Clark and Rapuano mentioned in my talk. Unfortunately, I'm contributing to the unseen hand remaining unseen. But I very much enjoyed the presentations of their work and mentions of their work yesterday and today. So what we see here, interestingly enough, in the 1920s, or actually a little bit earlier than that, at the time of the First World War, as modernism is emerging in Europe and the Garden City movement is emerging on the other side of the Atlantic, there are New Yorkers who are very much thinking about this too. And the master of this, the master of the... No problem. The master of the garden apartment, speaking of the unseen hand, is a man named Andrew Thomas, who I think has received much less credit than he deserves. He's really the master of the garden apartment, particularly in Queens, particularly in Jackson Heights. And unlike many of his contemporaries, his architectural contemporaries, particularly Americans, who it tended for a very long time to be a gentleman's profession. So many of the people who went into architecture came from wealth, had studied abroad. Thomas is the exception to that. He is a New Yorker who grew up in tenements in Manhattan, and so he understood the needs of housing serving a less affluent population firsthand. And his real contribution, in addition to bringing the garden directly into architecture, into residential architecture, was to conceive of the problem not on the basis of the individual building, but of the entire block. And so what we see on the top are his plans for Linden Court of 1921. And we see very clearly how he's looking at the entire block, but he's also breaking up the street front into individual buildings, and then incorporating small courtyards both on the street side and on the interior side, and then bringing together the central space as a unified garden. Below we see the work of one of his contemporaries, George Wells, and this is also in Jackson Heights, called Cambridge Court, built in 1923. Much of this has been sacrificed to parking. If the garden apartment is being developed and, in a sense, mastered out in the outer boroughs, there are people who are interested in introducing open space into residential developments in denser parts of the city. And this is Tudor City, of course, in the East 40s. And it's developed by the Fred French Company, who hires H. Douglas Ives to articulate the plan. And they're bringing in small-scale parks right into the heart of the city. Interestingly, Fred French coined the term walk to work, but at the same time that he's advocating urban lifestyles, he's also bringing a bit of suburbia into the heart of the city. It's really in the work for lower income people that we see this effort to bring open space into residential developments most clearly in New York. Here we see the Amalgamated Houses on the Lower East Side, designed by the firm of Springsteen and Goldhammer, completed in 1930. Springsteen and Goldhammer were largely Bronx-based architects, again, people who have fallen through, to some extent, the cracks of history, but who are really first-class architects, and this is arguably their masterwork. It's built by the Amalgamated Garment Workers Union, so it comes directly out of the labor movement and directly out of the concept that housing is a human right. Interestingly, New York really sets the national agenda in terms of recognizing housing as a human right, including, I would say, open space as an open right, as a human right. The New York City Housing Authority is founded in 1934. The National Housing Act, coming out of Washington, doesn't happen until 1937. This is happening in 1930, based, as I said, on the efforts of the labor movement. Goldstein Springsteen and Goldhammer are working very much on the block model, but they understand the value of breaking up the street wall. The building is built out to the extent that it can, but they break up the street wall with these small courts so that you get a sense of individual buildings. But it's really inside where the action is, and this is very much influenced by contemporaneous European developments. This beautiful archway immediately recalls the Karl Marx house in Vienna, and this is very much of a statement about not only a decent way to live in the city, but the courtyard becomes even more than simply a way of getting open space and light and air into the apartments. It becomes a symbol of a new society that's based on cooperation and not on competition, and so this communal space really takes on an enormous resonance. In 1935, the newly formed New York City Housing Authority targets a location in the East Village for what will become known as the first houses, and it is indeed the first NYCHA project. It begins as an effort to rehabilitate existing tenements, and the idea is that they will do extensive renovations of the existing buildings and also knock down every third building to introduce open space. But once they start actually working on the project, they realize that the condition of the buildings is so poor that they essentially knock them down. I think that they really rebuild from the foundations up. So it's essentially a new work of architecture. And here we see the new buildings, and you can see that the concept of knocking down every third building is incorporated into the new design, and then the collective space is articulated in a rather formal but certainly very effective way. At the same time, something else very different is happening, and this idea of modernism is beginning to come to America. An enormous swath of land between Christie and Forsyth Streets on the Lower East Side is cleared. Now, interestingly, this is happening in the late 20s. It's cleared to improve vehicular access to the Manhattan Bridge. It is not cleared to create housing for lower-income New Yorkers. So it's very much of a planning effort. But then it turns into a competition for housing. And most of the competition entries are for rather traditional architecture, but this, produced by George Howe and William Lescaz, is introducing a whole new vocabulary to New York. Lescaz was a Swiss modernist who came to New York, and George Howe, interestingly enough, was really a society architect who was most known for his houses for the very rich in the main line of Philadelphia. He also is the dean of the Yale Law School, and the two of them form this sort of interesting partnership in which they are really bringing in a whole new vocabulary to America. We see the modernist slab buildings that they proposed with the outdoor exposed walkways. But for our purposes, it's really how they treated the open space that's most interesting. And what we see here is that they're emphasizing the ground plane. They're lifting the buildings up on pilotis, and they have a whole new vision of the city as a kind of continuous, publicly accessible plane. So we're beyond the building, we're beyond the block, we're now into a whole new, brave new world of publicly accessible space in New York. These are the Amsterdam houses completed on a site west of Lincoln Center in 1947 by NYCHA. They have already developed what will become a kind of signature for them of the red brick towers in the park. But here we still see a maintenance of classical principles of designing in terms of the open space. It's really treated as a series of outdoor rooms on different levels. The idea of procession is still very important, moving from one outdoor space to another, and it's really quite effective and remains so. Here we see the Lillianwold Houses on the Lower East Side by Frederick Ackerman and Lafayette Goldstone, completed in the same year. But we see here that the buildings are getting taller, the spaces are getting larger, they're less differentiated, they're less about this sense of intimacy. By the late 1950s, the 1960s, there's an effort to pitch some of these spaces to sort of particular constituencies. This is the Gala East Harlem Plaza, adjacent to the Jefferson Houses in East Harlem. The plaza is designed by Meyer, Whittlesey, and Glass, completed in 1960. The Jefferson Houses completed the year before. This is designed for the needs of the larger community, providing a playground with sort of for active play, with some whimsical touches added, with a very different tone from some of the other plazas that we've seen. These are the Carver Houses, which were mentioned today in East Harlem by Pomerantz and Breen's, with a landscape by M. Paul Friedberg, and completed in 1964. This is very much of a larger space. It's been radically redesigned. This is kind of a hybrid where we get some sort of differentiation in the space happening on different levels, but it's not quite the intimacy that we saw at the Amsterdam houses. These are three projects from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, respectively, all in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. On top, we see the Brownsville Houses, Frederick Frost, and John Ambrose Thompson, completed in 1947, with lower buildings defining an open space. Below, we see, in the middle, we see the Van Dyke Houses by Isidore and Zachary Rosenfeld, completed in 1950, with taller buildings defining somewhat less differentiated space. Below, we see the Glenmore Plaza by Pomerantz and Breen's, 1968, and this breaks from the, by then, standard NYCHA format, where the buildings are scattered throughout a very large site. Here, the buildings are collected around and focused on a central courtyard that's defined by each of the buildings having arcaded walkways. So it's a more formal, focused approach. This is happening in the late 60s. On the left, we see the Jacob Riis houses as they were originally designed and completed in 1949. And on the right, we see the redesign completed in 1966 by M. Paul Friedberg. This was shown, Charles showed this last night. The landscape on the right no longer exists. And we see very much of the kind of rethinking of these spaces that was happening in the 1960s. Partly this is being informed by this notion of defensible space, which comes to the fore in the 1960s, and the sense that the very open plazas, as we see on the left, had become breeding grounds for antisocial behavior. Okay. We see here the Riverside Park community in West Harlem, completed in 1972. And here there's this kind of striking contrast between the brutal way in which the complex faces the street we see above, and then the open space that's provided for the tenants below, where clearly more thought and articulation has gone. And so the notion of public space is sort of morphing. This is very much for the enjoyment of the people who live in the development, but can't be enjoyed by those simply passing by. I'm going to end with two comparisons, two pairs of slides. Here we see the Penn Station South development in Chelsea, designed by Herman Jesser and completed in 1963. This is also growing out of the labor movement. This is built for members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This is national news when this is completed. President Kennedy is at the opening of this. It's a massive development intended to keep middle-income people in the city and particularly close to where they work. And the buildings are scattered amongst this enormous site with open spaces that actually took on a more convincing park-like quality than many other similar developments. But even if several years later, after their completion, by the late 1960s, people are questioning the validity of this kind of open space. And there's a proposal to actually ring the entire development with 6-story buildings to enclose this whole thing into a kind of more discrete campus, more to hold the street wall, because it's considered that street life is such an important part of New York City, and that these open plazas, this continuous ground plane that had been advocated by Howe and Lescaz, is actually anti-urban. So there's a proposal to do that. To ring the entire site with low buildings. At the same time, the park inside is going to be raised, and in some cases actually bridge the traversing streets. So it's sort of moving in 2 directions at once. On the one hand, it's more urban, and on the other hand, it's really creating public space as a kind of campus based on almost a university model, very removed from the daily realities of the city outside. This reconsidering of the space is advocated by Mayor Lindsay's newly established, newly formed Housing and Development Agency. This is 1968, and they hire the San Francisco-based landscape architect Lawrence Halpern to reconsider this.
Did it happen?
No, absolutely did not happen. So sorry. What did happen in the Bronx was another Herman Gesser project, and this is Coop City. And this is, at the time that it was built, some people claimed that it was the largest housing development anywhere ever in the world. It's just this massive, massive project with 55,000 residents. Ada Louise Huxtable later commented that New York was the only city in the world that could build essentially a city within a city and people barely noticed. Here we see that the open space is really undistinguished. And what happens is that in 1971, Zion and Breen are asked to come in. And we'll see what they came up with in just one second, and that will be my conclusion. But if in some ways bringing open space into the city, into NYCHA developments, can be seen as a kind of effort to achieve a rus in urb, a country in city, then this latest effort is perhaps not bringing in the nearby suburbs into the city, but perhaps the rolling hills of I don't know exactly where. And this is actually a created landscape. This is realized in parts of Co-op City. All I can think of when I look at this is the Irving Berlin song, Way Out West in West End Avenue. So exactly what this has to do with the traditions, the architectural and urban landscape traditions that we've looked at very briefly this afternoon, I'm not sure. But I think this is perhaps a good place to end. So thank you.